Marisha here, and today I'm going to share with you my views as an American on King Charles's coronation. When I moved here, it was just a couple of days before the Queen's funeral, so I was lucky enough to be here for both those sort of big historic events, the funeral and then, of course, the coronation several months later. And the day of the coronation is actually the loneliest I have ever felt. Certainly since being in the UK, but also maybe even ever. And this is why. I was dating someone at the time, and I asked him to come to the coronation with me, and he wouldn't. I think he obviously didn't really care about the event itself very much, and he didn't live in London. Even though he lived at the end of one of the metro lines, it was technically, outside of London in zone, I don't know, way out in BFE, and I guess didn't want to fight the crowds to come in. So I had to go by myself, and I walked there, and from where I was living in the dorm at the time to get to the screens that were in the center of Hyde Park and not toward the eastern edge of Hyde Park like they had been for the funeral. So that was one way that I was disappointed, as I was expecting one thing because I had been to the funeral and it was something else when I got there. It took about an hour. So it was an hour's walk. It was raining steadily the whole time. And I get there to Hyde Park, and again for the funeral, because I think maybe they had had more screens or they were more spread out, the people were more spread out, and you had space to breathe and even just to sit on the ground and you could watch. And I remember sitting and watching, and there wasn't anybody around me. I could spread my arms out all the way and not even touch another person. But for the coronation, everybody was standing. I mean, that makes sense because it was raining, but also it was just a lot more compact. Everybody was sort of pressed up against each other in the rain, and people have their umbrellas, and some people are smart enough to just tuck them behind their head, recognizing that if they put them up like you normally would, they're obstructing the view of the people behind them. But not everybody is that smart. And so, I'm sort of jostling. I feel like Zacchaeus trying to jostle for like a way to actually see the screen. And I've already walked an hour in the rain by myself, and I'm there alone when I really wanted a British person to be with me so that if I had questions, I could ask them, right? And say like, "Oh, well, what does this mean?" or "Why do you guys do this?" But I didn't have that, so I'm just there by myself in this sea of people. And then, the ceremony starts, and I'm watching the ceremony. And that is when it dawns on me that I am an American. And what I am feeling in this moment is because I am American. There are a lot of times when I'm here and I feel like I'm a foreigner, but it doesn't matter where I'm from. It's just because I'm a foreigner that I'm feeling this. And anybody from anywhere would feel this way. But this is one of the few times when it is specifically because I'm an American that I am feeling the way that I am. And that is because I am watching a ceremony that is both a state ceremony and a religious ceremony, right? Because in America, one of the concepts that is like laid down in like the founding of our nation is the idea of separation of church and state. So I'm watching this, and as a Christian, there's a part of me that thinks, well, I guess it's really cool that there are some people being exposed to scripture by watching this who would not otherwise be exposed to scripture. So that's good. But for the most part, as a Christian and as an American, I'm thinking this is just I'm appalled, right? That you have this state ceremony to initiate a head of state, and that there's religious elements blended into it. Because, for starters, I don't for a minute believe that Charles or any other member of the royal family is actually Christian in the sense that they pray on a regular basis asking for God's guidance, and they, ask themselves what would Jesus do when they're making decisions of governance. I mean, we're talking about a family that, you know, is basically parasites living off of UK tax dollars. Um, and they have generational wealth that was built on the backs of slaves and on colonization. And currently, right, the royal family has, racists and pedophiles and philanderers. And I just, obviously, I'm not one of those Americans who is a big fan of the royal family, um, though I know lots of Americans are. And then, more importantly, less about like the royal family themselves is the greater idea of having a state religion and how problematic that really is. That, when you look at the history of Christianity and you see when did it have its most like when did it flourish the most? When did it have its most like exponential growth? And it's when it was persecuted under the Roman government. And it's not until you get uh, a rise in Christian political power and you get the corrupting influence of the state, of political ambition, that you run into the Crusades and the Inquisition, etc. And, I'm an American coming from an America that currently has a very loud like group of people who want to marry church and state, who are making claims in their political speeches and are voting for politicians who are saying these things as though they are Christian and they want to pass certain legislation based on supposedly Christian ideas, even though what they're actually doing and saying is quite anti-Christ, really. What it is it's a rise in white Christian nationalism. It's not limited just to America. We're seeing it in other places around the world, right? This rise in sort of fascist ideas and people kind of using religion as a way to try to validate those ideas, even though what they're talking about is not biblical. The ideas that they're espousing are not biblical. So I'm very very sensitive to this topic because my faith is really important to me, and it's very upsetting to see that happening in my country and to see people who I once maybe respected fall for those ideas and to start espousing these ideas that are not biblical, and yet they are claiming the name of Christ, right? They're false prophets. They're charlatans, whatever you want to call them, right? It's not Jesus that they're preaching, but they're using his name to try to gain political power. And there are a lot of parallels that you can draw between what's happening with that and what happened with the Lutheran Church in Germany in the 30s when it joined forces with the Nazi Party and the corruption of blending state and church. So as an American, as a Christian, I'm watching the ceremony and I'm very, very uncomfortable and slightly appalled. And it dawns on me that I'm in this sea of people. And obviously I can't read minds. Maybe there were other people who were thinking what I was thinking, but I seriously doubt it. I think that most of them were British citizens, and so they're watching their king, and of course, then it means something to them that it's never going to mean to me. He's not my king. And they are people who grew up, obviously, in a nation that has a state church, and it's very much, I think, for a lot of Britons, a cultural thing and not actually a religious thing. Because if you look at the polling numbers, the number of Britons who would call themselves Christian is really, really dwindling. It's less than 50% now. You can make the, I think, very legitimate argument that Britain is a post Christian nation at this point. But obviously, there's still very much like a cultural kind of historical attachment to this idea of having a state religion. And then I think that the people who were in the crowd who were not British citizens probably are mostly tourists who came for the coronation because they're enamored with the idea of the royal family. They're the sort of people who want to come and just buy a bunch of tat with Elizabeth's face on it or whatever. So I'm there and I'm thinking these things and I don't have anybody to talk to about it. And I think that's what made me feel the loneliest, right? Is that, if my boyfriend had been there, then I could have said like, oh, like this is really interesting to me as an American because, we have separation of church and state. And so seeing a state church and seeing like that your head of state is being installed in a religious ceremony is really strange to me. What are your thoughts on this? And how much do you think your thoughts align with what you would say, like the typical Briton's thought is? Because just as not all Americans are homogenous, and obviously I don't speak for all Americans when I say I'm not a big fan of the royal family, he isn't necessarily going to speak for all Brits with his opinion, but I think he might have ideas of what the majority view might be. Um, and I think grieved over the fact that I didn't have the opportunity to have that actual cross-cultural exchange that I think would have been very interesting. And potentially could have been a very kind of like enriching and rewarding conversation to have. And obviously, yes, I have British friends that I could go to now and say, okay, well, what are your thoughts on this? And let's have like a conversation about this. Because I go to church here and it is a Church of England church. And so, like, I know Church of England people that I could talk to about this. But in the moment, I didn't have anybody there, right? In the moment, while this is happening, I didn't have that, and I was acutely aware of that, and you know how sometimes you can feel really lonely in a sea of people anyway? That's how I felt. And it just, the weather just sort of was married that idea. It was like, oh, even the weather is like drizzly and terrible and depressing, and just sort of how I felt. And the only thing that salvaged the day was that Lego had a make and take of the coronation crown. So, if you're not aware, occasionally Lego stores will have what's called a make and take, and you can go and wait in line, and they have like a little build that you follow the instructions and you make it and you take it with you, and it's free. And I waited in line for an hour to make that crown. And it's again, it's what redeemed the day. Um, it's it's a good souvenir because it's a reminder of like, oh yeah, remember that day that was like the loneliest you ever felt. Um, and I want to say that in this channel again, I'm just gonna be honest about my experiences here, and most of them are positive. I'm so thankful that I've had this experience, and there's still times when I can't believe it's real and I'm like, oh man, I'm actually living in London. I'm so glad that I did it, and I have a lot of, again, great memories and amazing things that have happened to me, and I'll talk about those things, but it's not all been positive. There's definitely been some negatives as well, so I'm going to be honest about it, and this is one of them. The coronation for me, it was a very lonely experience. Um, and I would end by saying that if you were planning on traveling, even if it's just travel and not, oh, I'm going to actually go live somewhere for a while because I'm studying or I'm just going to pick up and move, you'll run into stuff like this. There will be negative things that will happen. Um, but they can become positive in the sense that they can be opportunities for personal growth, right? This is something that made me think about the idea of kind of the separation of church and state in a way that I would not have thought in the US. Certainly, it was something that I thought about because, when you're taught about it in school and when you are a person of faith, it's something that you do think about. But in the US, it was a bit more nebulous. when you're in the UK and you are smack like dab in the middle of a ceremony that is a state and religious ceremony, it forces you to think about it in a way that you wouldn't have before. And so you're sort of, it gives you a chance for sort of that introspection, like, well, what do I really think about this? And that's true for anything that you encounter that makes you uncomfortable or um, makes you feel like you're misunderstood or makes you feel like you're threatened or any sort of those kinds of emotions. Ask yourself, why am I feeling this way? And really allow yourself the time to reflect on that and use it as a chance for personal growth, a chance to learn about, again, other cultures, to start conversations with people, etc. So that's my thought on the coronation. I don't want to I recognize that a lot of people like the royal family, both abroad and also in the UK. I think it's still like 60% of Britons approve of the royal family. I don't mean you any ill will if you believe that. I just personally don't really understand because I do believe that they're actually parasites. And I know that people make the argument that they bring revenue into the country, but I think that probably the UK would be fine without them. Let's agree to disagree. Anyway, like, subscribe, tell your friends how gnarly this channel is, and I'll see you next time.